Hello, it's Roger Bisbee here from the Skill Builder channel. I'm back with another little rant, and this time I'd like to talk about rising damp, and specifically I'd like to talk about all the people who believe there is no such thing as rising damp. This idea came from the fact that a couple of people put out various videos on YouTube, and somebody wrote a book that said The Myth of Rising Damp. Loads and loads of people, probably the same kind of people that believe the earth is flat, took hold of this very simple premise and this very simple problem, and they said to themselves, glory be, there's no such thing as rising damp. We can all move on. We don't need to worry about damp-proof courses or injecting with any of those nasty chemicals. We can just hack off all our plaster, get rid of all that paint, open the windows, freshen everything up, and then the damp will miraculously disappear. Absolutely right. Spot on, people. It does miraculously disappear, but to conflate that with the fact that there is no such thing as rising damp is complete nonsense. If you're saying there is no such thing as rising damp, and let's face it, this is not people who are sort of going, there may not be such a thing. They're absolutely convinced, saying there is no such thing as rising damp. Then all those people that have been building damp-proof courses into houses for probably the last 100 years, complete waste of time. Why are they doing it? Why didn't anybody figure this out and say to them, boys, no need, girls, there's no need to put damp-proof courses on. Just carry on laying your bricks and everything will be fine, because all you got to do is hack off your plaster, open your windows, and people point towards Venice and they say, well, if there was rising damp, there would be rising damp in Venice. Well, there is rising damp in Venice. If you've ever been to Venice, you will see rising damp all over the place. The University of Bologna spends a great deal of time, in fact, they got a department dedicated to preservation of historic buildings, and a large part of what they do is looking into the problem of rising damp. So if you go to the Basilica in St. Mark's Square, you will see tiles that have been put up on the wall to try and stop the damp showing through. These lovely tiles that were done many years ago, and actually what they found is, even though those tiles were about 2 meters high, the damp is grinning over the top of them. The damp keeps on rising. So why is it that people think it's such a difficult concept to understand? Damp rises. I mean, think about it. The whole world, our very existence, relies upon the fact that damp rises. Of course it does, because if you look above you, what do you see? Clouds. On certain days of the year you see clouds, and that is rising damp. That is damp which is evaporating and rising up to the heavens, and then once it condenses there and it gets heavy enough and it comes across some mountains or something else, then we get rain. Glory be, we love rain, don't we? That's damp which is climbing up by some miraculous process that these people deny. It's happening inside trees. Damp is rising up. There's not a pump there or anything else. The damp is creeping up through all the capillary tubes inside of the bark on the outer skin, and it's rising up and it's going out into all those branches and feeding those leaves and giving us that lovely green canopy. And if you look in the rainforests of the Amazon, you see a whole ecosystem which is based upon damp turning to vapor, rising up, condensing, and then coming back down within its own tree cover. It creates the rain and the rain falls back down. So why is it such a difficult concept for people to understand? Why does it take such an imaginative leap for those people to see that you also get rising damp in masonry? Well, they point towards a canal wall and they say, look, if there was rising damp, how come that canal wall is so dry? Well, the simple thing is, good people, that canals were built by Victorian engineers and they were well aware of the problems of rising damp. They did not take chances. They used waterproof cement. Waterproof cements have been around since the Roman times, by the way, and they used a waterproof cement, a very strong mix of sand and cement mortar in those brick courses, and they used engineering bricks, which are basically like quarry tiles, very hard, no capillary tubes inside them, nowhere for the damp to rise up. That in itself, if you lay a couple of courses of Staffordshire Blues or something like that, Accrington Norries, and you use a waterproof cement, that is a damp-proof course. That's what we used to use as damp-proof courses before we started using things like 2 courses of slate, one over the top of the other, staggered so you don't get too much creep up there. And then we started using things like bitumen, and then we used plastic as a damp-proof course. And again, you people that are saying there is no such thing as rising damp, you're saying all that is completely unnecessary. Put your money where your mouth is, because if you're a bricklayer and you actually believe there is no such thing as rising damp, Why are you bothering? Why don't you have the confidence to just build a house and see if damp rises up? The reason is obviously because the building regulations won't allow you to do it. The building inspector will come along and say, take that wall down, put a damp proof course in. So what do they know that these other people don't know? Or what do these other people who say there is no such thing as rising damp know that the building inspectors know? It completely baffles me, because I've seen rising damp, I've seen rotten skirting boards. In fact, in my early days of plumbing, I used to go around, remove the radiators, remove the pipe inside these houses so that the damp proof guys could come in, hack off all that plaster, because the plaster contains hygroscopic salts which attract more damp. So they had to get rid of all that and then hack it right back to the brickwork. They injected it with the silicone, which was a bit of a hit and miss affair because a lot of it ended up just leaking out. But they pressure treated it with silicone, and then as a belt and braces measure, they put a sand and cement with a waterproofer in back over the wall before they replastered. Now, I've got issues with doing that because I think actually that when you create a sand and cement barrier inside your house, then condensation will form on that because it's not getting through in quite the same way as it would if it was just a lime plaster or something like that. So this is where people say, well, that's all you've got to do. You've got to build with lime, you've got to render with lime, you've got to use lime plasters. That's absolutely fantastic. But nobody does it, or hardly anybody does it, because builders want to get the job done. And if you've ever built with lime mortar, you'll know it's a very slow process. Years ago, what they would do is they would bring the cool stuff in and they would mix it up on site, and they would leave it like a hot lime. They would leave it cooking and then they would use it. So it took days and days of process, laboriously shoveling that stuff backwards and forwards to get it cooking, and then they could use it to lay. And of course, there are also health hazards. If it got splashed in the eye, it would do a lot of harm. So nobody liked using it. And when sand and cement came along, they went, glory be, we don't have to use lime anymore. We can build really fast. The sand and cement goes off a lot faster and we can get the house built in no time. And that's basically why they moved away from using lime towards using ordinary Portland cement. But what I would say is they use Portland cement in too strong a mix very often. And that does create problems in itself, because it can't move as the buildings move and expand and contraction. The Portland cement doesn't move and it cracks and it traps in moisture. And that's perfectly true, because water doesn't evaporate through sand and cement in quite the same way as it does through a lime mortar. But if you've got a damp proof course in there, then you don't need to worry about that, because you've stopped the damp from rising. Therefore, you're not worried about having to let it evaporate. Now, all these people who say you don't need a damp proof course, it's a waste of time injecting the brickwork with those things that I have championed on here, which is the dry rods, which is Safeguard Chemicals product, which is a siloxane, which is used the world over and has been tested many times in many different independent laboratories, got BBA certificates and everything else. So these things do work, even though people say they don't work. They actually line the capillary pores in the brickwork with this glass-like substance that allows all the moisture to evaporate out of the bricks. It stops more moisture rising in its place. So that's an absolutely ideal situation. You stop the damp coming in, get rid of the damp that's in the building, and then you don't need to have to worry. These people who say, well, you don't need that, all you need to do is hack off the plaster and do everything else. But think about that. What are you actually doing there? Because the damp is continuing to enter the building and to rise. And you've almost admitted that there is such a thing as rising damp by saying, hack off all that sand and cement plaster, hack off all that gypsum plaster, take away all those plastic paints, let the building breathe. Well, why has it got to breathe? The only reason it's got to breathe is because there's bloody rising damp coming up through it. That's the whole point. You're not curing anything. All you're doing is letting the building evaporate that water out. So where does that water evaporate out? Well, in the old days, we used to have chimneys and we used to have water coming in through the walls, and it would evaporate out because it would be sucked up the chimneys. The fireplaces would warm the house. We had a fireplace in every room, and the chimneys would be like these giant extractor fans, and they would be taking all the moisture away. The moisture would continue to enter the house, but it would be taken away on a daily basis. Now, of course, we don't want to live with all those fires in all those rooms. We closed up all the chimney breasts. We put double glazing in, we put draft proofing in because we want to stay warm, we put insulation in the house, and of course if damp gets in there, then it's in a fug basically. It doesn't have the same opportunity to evaporate out like it did. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That just means is you're allowing that damp to get into the building and you're not allowing it to get out. So of course, all these people who say, well, just let the building breathe, are you prepared to have the huge heating bills and all the cold drafts and everything else that go with that process? Because it's not a magical process. That moisture is still coming into the building. It's still rising up. And the fact that you can't see it is simply the fact that you're letting it all escape on a daily basis rather than building it up. Now, I fully accept that you shouldn't go into a house and if it's an old house, start putting impervious things on like strong sand and cements and so on. To say that you shouldn't put a damp proof course on is completely wrong-headed. Put the damp proof course in and then do what you can to make sure you don't trap any moisture in and you've got the best of both worlds. Now, all these plasterers who go around rendering buildings outside with a sand and cement and they put a waterproofer in it, that I think is a mistake, because I think what happens there, water gets into the building or water is in the building and it's trying to evaporate out through the walls as it would normally do even without the damp proof course. It'll migrate through the masonry and escape, and of course as soon as you put a waterproof renderer on the outside, you're slowing down that process of that water escaping and you're letting it build up within the walls itself. And of course as soon as you do that, you lower the U value of the walls, because damp insulation is no insulation at all. I'm not talking about cavity insulation, I'm talking about the inherent insulation that is in the brickwork. But of course if you have cavity wall insulation, you're in an even worse situation, because if you put a waterproof render on the outside and you've got a cavity wall insulation, you are still locking the moisture in. But of course if you've got a cavity wall, you won't get such a problem with a rising damp, because you've got this air gap between the inner skin and the outer skin. It will to some extent stop that damp from migrating across. And where we see damp migrating across in situations like that is across wall ties, where people have left muck when the bricklayers have been bricklaying and they haven't cleaned it off properly, or they just let all the snots drop down and form on the wall ties, and that forms a passage for damp to come across. That's what we call penetrated damp, and that's quite common. The other place that you find it is when all the mortar drops down inside the cavity. The bricklayers are in a bit of a hurry, they're throwing these buildings up as fast as they can. The mortar is dropping down inside the cavity and it's accumulating at the bottom just about where your damp proof course is. So you look at it and you think, oh, I've got a damp proof course here, why am I getting rising damp? The reason you're getting rising damp is simply that you've bridged that damp proof course with all that mortar. The moisture can get past it and then it can start appearing on the outside wall. Now the other thing is, you will find in about 80% of the cases that when you see a problem with rising damp, it may well be that it's just condensation. And if you get rid of the airborne moisture in your house with extractor fans and so on, you will cut down on the condensation. You may solve the problem like that without having to worry about having a remedial damp proof course. But to say it's unnecessary is completely false. And of course I fully admit that when you've got condensation in the house, it will tend to collect around the bottom of the wall, because that's the coldest spot. Obviously heat rises, the cold falls, and so all around the bottom of the house where you've got that cold bridging coming up from the foundations, you will find a cold spot around there and you will find that damp forms around there. So you can mistake condensation for rising damp. But if you've got a damp proof course, even if you've got an old slate one, if your house is 100 years old and there's a slate one in there, it's very unlikely to have failed. So if somebody comes into you and says, oh, your damp proof course has failed, you need to have all these rods put in or injections, that's probably wrong. You need to get a second opinion on it. What I'm trying to say is there's a balance here between the people who say there is no rising damp and the people who say there is. I'm hoping that my little rant has brought these two polarized sides together, and that somewhere in the middle we can meet and peace will break out across the land. Fat chance. I reckon in 10 years time we'll still be getting people on the bottom of our damp videos going, there's no such thing as rising damp because I saw a video that said there's no such thing as rising damp. There's also a video that says there's a crash Spitfire on the moon, so why don't you go and have a look at that? So another argument that these people use is they say that, well, the Victorians never suffered from rising damp, and all those people who built buildings years ago without damp proof courses never suffered from rising damp. Well, they did. I've got news for you. If you look back through some books on Victorian building, you'll see that they went to huge lengths to try and stop rising damp. They put up oiled canvases on the insides of the walls, suspended on wooden battens to try and stop the damp from showing through. Even the Romans, if you go back to ancient Rome, there's a fascinating document there which was written about the buildings in ancient Rome and some of the problems they had and some of the ways that they solved them. And a great deal of that dedicated to the problem of damp in buildings, and specifically rising damp and using a waterproof cement to stop it. And of course the Romans famously also used terracotta and other tiles which they used to try and stop the damp. But you see damp throughout the world. It's not just something that occurs in cold climates. It's not something that occurs in Britain and not in Amsterdam. You've got damp everywhere you go, and we regularly get emails from people living in Spain who say, I've got a property I bought in Spain and it's got rising damp. Well, we know full well that that isn't condensation. What that is you've got hot weather there, you've got moisture in the ground, and it's evaporating out of the walls. So as it evaporates out of the wall, more damp is drawn up into those walls, and it's a very, very common problem. Exacerbated of course by air conditioning, which makes cold surfaces on the inside, and if you've got humid air outside which contains a lot of moisture, as it creeps through, where's it going to go? Onto those walls. I'm Roger Busby, come back to see me soon. I'll have more to rant about, I'm sure.
Mission control, it appears we've had a major malfunction.